Just as an FYI, we are asking that if you have a question to speak into the microphone because we are taping today's program. So we want to be able to capture this on the tape. So just make sure you raise your hand so that our microphone people can try to get to both sides of the room and make sure that your questions are answered. So next, I don't know that anyone wouldn't like to have a crystal ball when it comes to real estate. The panel of experts was organized as a follow-up to last year's summit when we explored how communities should best respond to the changes of e-commerce. Now we want to explore how best to respond to the changes with brick and mortar stores closing because of e-commerce. Whether it's a mall or a box store or a few storefronts in a shopping plaza, vacant real estate is not a good thing. Moderating this panel is Alliance board member Jim Ford. Jim is the managing partner of Trace LLC, which is a real estate development and consulting firm. Prior to that, he was a partner at Centerpoint Properties Trust. Jim is going to introduce the other panelists. A warm welcome for Jim and this next panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
Hi, Kelly. How are you? Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to start like Becky. I'm going to start by standing up for a bit because I probably think better that way, but then dive into it. So, as Kelly said earlier, for those of you who were here with us last year, we tried to explore the topic of e-commerce and its effects, and as both my co-panelists and friends can attest to, we see it every day, and from the real estate world, from the economic development world, and the effects and changes that companies like Amazon, the behemoth, have had on real estate and economic development. But what we didn't cover last year, and it just is an important topic, as Kelly mentioned, is what does that do to other sectors of real estate and economic development? Many people are fearful and concerned that kind of the retail real estate world is going down in a bad way because of these large e-com fulfillment centers, and because the supply chain and consumer purchasing habits are changing. I wanted to start with some of the good news that we don't focus on, but purely statistically, CBRE, one of the leading real estate companies in the world, actually put out a study recently, and some of the facts that we don't realize is that despite recent headlines implying that e-commerce is rapidly eroding retail store sales, the fact is that more than 90% of retail sales still occur in physical stores. So when you say Amazon, the behemoth, or other retailers, which we'll talk about in a bit, and the effect of their operations and how their supply chain works, it still is less than 5% of the actual consumer spending nationwide that occurs online. And I know that sounds crazy. We still are individuals that want to touch things, feel things, be impulsive, have an interactive experience, and that's all effective. It affected in what we're talking about in the form of retail real estate and what's occurring there. A good example is that Apple, one of the largest, of course, electronics companies in the world, and technology companies in the world. For those of you that don't know, right over here in the Magnificent Mile on Michigan Avenue, they actually rebuilt a store there recently, and it wasn't really necessary to replace their spending patterns or how their customers are buying or purchasing their products. It was about changing the experience that the customer has. So us as consumers still, as I said earlier, want to touch, feel things, be interactive, and want an experience that's going to cause you then to make a purchase. It doesn't mean that it might not happen online nowadays, because you do want to, once again, especially something bigger like a TV or something, it's a lot easier that if you really feel like you're getting free delivery to your house, of course I'm going to take advantage of that, as opposed to historically bringing your car out and having to move it. Furniture, those type of things are all affected by that. Another interesting stat that I didn't really focus on and quite realize until I did some research was online sales are not the exclusive domain of pure play e-retailers, as more than 50% of online sales are still made by brick and mortar, historically, retailers. Williams-Sonoma is a good example. Huge consumer goods type company. Over 50% of their sales, it's like 52%, actually do occur online, but they still need their retail store base to drive those sales. So once again, and I'm going to pose the questions to the experts here, once again, is a true definition of retail real estate changing? We believe it is, but ultimately, is it becoming non-existent, or, as Kelly said, with the crystal ball type mentality, is it becoming where we don't need that, and we've got to adapt those type of real estate in buildings, strip malls, regional malls, all those type of things we'll talk about in a second here. Does that mean that there's an evolution or an adaptation of those to other forms of real estate? That's all good questions, and that's where this crystal ball mentality, as Kelly mentioned, is something that we're all trying to understand on a daily basis. So with that in mind, I first want to introduce Tricia Braun. Tricia is the Chief Operating Officer of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. Tricia's originally from Minnesota, but went to school at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. She spent a couple years after school up in Minnesota doing economic development, but brings over 20 years of experience in the economic development world to our panel discussion here today. Interesting enough, and a lot of my background is distribution and really industrial real estate, as a lot of you know. Tricia spent years out in Riverside, California, which to me is part of the overall region like we would see down in Will County here, where it's just massive amounts, hundreds of millions of square feet of industrial. So very familiar with the early craze of e-com and what the effect on that was. But since coming back to this Milwaukee region, I should say the state in general, the whole state of Wisconsin, her focus has been a little bit more broad from the commercial perspective and industrial, and seeing a lot of the activities, a lot of discussions we're talking about. So I thank Tricia for making it today. And then secondly is Steve Horvath. Steve, I'll admit it, Steve and I have been friends since third grade. So known Steve a long time, but I felt he was a perfect person to address this topic. Steve is the president of Conlin Commercial Real Estate, which is a well-known entity here in Chicago, but spans up well beyond Chicago, up into the Milwaukee region, down south, and in many other states. But Steve, as I said, brings over 20 years of commercial real estate experience. He personally has conducted over $500 million in transactions through his career. He focuses on a lot of different areas, from investment sales to 1031 exchanges to property assemblages, but also has, as I said, a very good knowledge of retail and what its effects are in general for the marketplace. So I thank my two friends for joining me today. And with that, those of you who know me, and especially from last year, know that I think out of the box. I think out of the lines. So we're very informal in nature, but formal then, because we want to put some structure to this. But believe me, during our discussion, if anybody has any thoughts or questions, we won't try to make it too complicated so the mics aren't flying around the room the whole time. But we welcome your participation through our discussion. And with that, I kind of want to start with Tricia and kind of talk about this overall effect from an economic development standpoint in what we're kind of seeing from the e-com craze and how that really affects what we call our brick and mortar type mentality or store level from a retail perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Jim. I think we'll start off with 2 points. Going back to my Riverside days, and Jim and I were kind of trading war stories beforehand. When the economy hit the skids in 2007, 2008, because of the amount of industrial and warehouse and distribution uses that were in that area, and the pace at which it was being built, it kind of had this bad cycle. It was truly kind of an epicenter of feeling the effects of that recession. Our vacancy rates were through the roof. Our retail vacancy rates were upwards of 50% in some areas. I think we actually were even featured on some of the CNN and some of the news shows as shuttered stores and everything. And so So, with the retail there, then the e-commerce starts. So it starts kind of putting the nail in the coffin. So you had to be really creative and forward thinking about how you could reactivate that space. So now you look at kind of the general where we're all feeling it. And, in economic development, you're concerned with businesses, jobs, those types of things. But for communities, you really need that kind of that heartbeat or that lifeblood that your commercial uses provide, whether it's your central business district, kind of your main street areas, or it's your shopping centers and your strip malls, or even just a regular mall, because that's kind of that quality of life piece that people are looking for. And as everybody is trying to retain and attract talent, if you don't have those lifestyle amenities that are healthy and what they're interested in the community, they're going to look somewhere else. And so, really trying to stay ahead of what could happen. Look at, identifying those businesses that are probably more at risk than others, and then start thinking about as a community how you want to prepare for this, whether it's through more creative zoning or planning, through even having community charrettes when there are a number of storefronts. And then also really having strong relationships with your building owners. And I think especially in smaller towns, I don't know how many of you are from smaller communities, but that can be kind of a make or break, because you've got folks, they need to lease their buildings, or if they're absentee landlords, and what that can do to kind of the vibrancy of the downtown. So I don't know how much you want me to get into examples, Jim. I could keep rambling. So I think I kind of just, I guess, tease it up of the things that you want to be looking for.
Yeah, I've got a couple points on what you were talking about and how you mentioned this emerging online, and it is still emerging. When you talk about 3% of all retail, that is only 3% of all retail is done from online retailers that do not have bricks and mortar. So it's such a small market, and it is generational. I mean, what we're all going to talk about here today is it's global, it's generational, it's an experience. You mentioned Williams-Sonoma, and interesting that, one of the leaders that is about 50-50, you really have to peel back, the onion here to get down to each one of these statistics or examples and look at it from a global approach. What are they also known for? Online registry, right? And there's an experience, and this is kind of how this ties in together, of bricks and mortar to online. These are going to be the fabrics of our future that are going to have to work together. But the experience of, if you've ever done this, most married people have, the big joy in that is taking the gun around the store and zapping everything that you want, and then it gets set up online, and that's where that statistic gets pushed to 50. But it didn't happen without that experience of people going in and spending the day or time and picking those products out. So I do believe that effect is going to be great on the bricks and mortar. It's just, how's it going to play out in the future? It's a small margin now, but that said, over the past 10 years, 15% growth of online sales versus 4.5% in bricks and mortar. So if that gap continues in that margin over the next 3-5 years, that's where we could see a big shift. And as Tricia was saying, that's where economic development people and government and communities really need to start thinking about all of their product and how to utilize it.
And that's, I would agree, Steve. I mean, you brought some thoughts in my mind, is that, Crate and Barrel here in Chicago is another good example of that.
Totally.
Or also, I mean, Macy's, all right? And people talk about Macy's has closed some stores. It's true. But over 20% of their sales now, they're learning to adapt. Over 20% of their sales now are online. But still, I mean, to me, the old Marshall Field's here in Chicago, or eventually bought by Macy's, to me, that's a location where if I wanted to go and have an experience to look at the latest products that whoever's got, I want to physically go there and see what they are. And
See, but again, this is why this conversation's so good, and this is why all of you kind of open up your mind, because this is a creative, discussion. This isn't, drill down, we have the answers to these questions. This is about the future, and exactly what he just said. This is why it's generational. This is what he wants to do, right? And no offense, you we're the same age, right? So,
my hair's grayer.
but he is of that age where that's important to him, right? millennials just surpassed baby boomers in total population, and that's not a lot of how they think, okay? So this is where, you know, these gears and these levers start turning to how is all this going to work together as we embark over the next 3, 5, 10 years, because people like us, that's important, you know, but to somebody that's 19 to 32 right now, maybe not so important.
Well, it's funny with where we're, and yes, as Steve said, we are the same age, and I pointed out my hair is grayer, but but even the spending patterns of the technology as an example, right, with electronics and all that, I mean, I'm still behind the curve on that of user type opportunity or mentality. And I've wondered over the past 5 or 10 years of why, when I want to still go into a store, like a Best Buy or an H.H. Gregg, which is now gone, and understand, I mean, how could, you know, how could they have failed from a physical, you know, bricks and mortar retailer? Whereas just a couple years back, I was reading an example of Best Buy, and they're still around, but they started using their actual retail stores as also fulfillment centers. I mean, have either of you, you know, experienced that where some of these retailers who are learning to adapt and they know they have to do it at light speed are using their physical retail stores and locations for the benefit of their e-com business?
I've seen it on the smaller retailers, you know, boutique, you know, kind of in middle markets and smaller boutique towns that do that kind of retail is, you know, they don't have the choice of a big footprint in a lot of states. And so they will take a little bit of extra space in order to do some fulfillment out of the back of the house.
Yeah, and I think we've seen more in the food uses where even sublease space to other tenants, it might not even be theirs, but where they may need like the refrigeration or something like that. So there's kind of that creative multi-use.
Or I mean, I guess another good example is that Lifetime was a Minnesota-based wellness, you know, corporation in the fact of building, you know, these large-scale, and I don't want to call them health clubs necessarily because it's a bad term because they have so many other amenities to them. But Kelly and I were talking about it. We recently saw a discussion about Lifetime wanting to maybe look at reuse or redevelopment of some empty spaces in these large regional malls. You know, maybe that's a good example of still being about health and benefit to us as individuals, but just as much as looking for some of these regional malls where I shopped as a kid and you know, watching that evolution coming in where there might be a good reuse opportunity there. And it was funny is that I was at a cousin's wedding yesterday and with my mom and dad for quite a bit of that, and they're close to 80, and telling my mom about this panel discussion today, and we talked about, as an example, you know, the Gap, and the Gap is another big retailer that when I was younger, they were in a mall, and then eventually they kind of got into more, you know, the regional, into your backyard neighborhood, and eventually they came literally into the neighborhood, and Steve and I both lived or at times of our lives lived in the Lincoln Park area, which is a young millennial type of area here in Chicago. And they have the same in the Milwaukee. They have the same, you know, in parts of Northwest Indiana, where they eventually were literally where you live. And now it's almost like a change in dynamic of the e-com world affecting, you know, kind of their existence and where they may be, but looking for that adaptation in general. So I wanted to jump in then a little bit about, you know, the actual real estate and what we're seeing. You know, as I mentioned, there's two maybe retail type sectors of concern that I've heard. I heard earlier this year down in Florida on another panel I sat on for the Florida State University Real Estate School about a gentleman who owns a bunch of regional malls, and I should say more strip center type malls, and his fear of what his tenants are going to be eventually, and was going to go from pure consumer retail to, you know, many other types of uses, and what, you know, from that perspective, kind of the strip mall type, smaller space mentality. Are we seeing, you know, other sector? Is it, you know, professional services? Is it medical? Is it, you know, more restaurants, as you mentioned earlier, Tricia, that are taking over and creating a new marketplace for those type of spaces?
Well, I think one of the three that you're always going to see in a strip center. You're going to have a donut shop, a coffee shop, a toe nail place, and something along those lines. So you'll probably always have those because you can't really get that online necessarily. But I think what we're starting to see, especially in communities that are trying to kind of reactivate neighborhoods, is taking a look at the overall development or the site itself and seeing if there's a way that you can kind of draw people in more for more. It goes back to that experience again. It's the experience that it provides where it makes it more attractive, whether you put the coffee shop on the front, and have the patio and just kind of have the dining, entertainment aspects, throughout. So I think that's the majority of what we're seeing in terms of revolutionary reuse of it yet. Not so much in terms of tenants, but Steve?
Yeah, no, I think it is that experience. And smaller retailers, I think that they have as much advantage as big malls that could get repurposed for different reasons. So if you look at, a large mall that has a lot of different options that could go to office space, fitness center, medical, hospital, senior living, all of these adaptive reuses that could happen. Small retail strip centers have similar purposes because smaller scale developments a lot of times can pencil out easier than taking down a huge, 200-acre area of parking that may need, to take down tax dollars and stuff that could greatly affect the community. There's some creative things, and those smaller retails are always going to be there. If you want to go get a beef sandwich, you're probably going somewhere in a strip mall or a small retail complex to do that. So I think they have, minimal risk.
From your perspectives, are you seeing more flexibility from the communities in which you're working? I know, there always used to be those standard formulas of parking and, the 360 architecture, whatever it might be. But are you seeing more of a, acknowledgement that they have to have flexibility built in?
No, go ahead, yeah.
They're starting to, okay? And one really big thing that you should all advocate for to anybody that you talk to is that along the lines of this crystal ball is that they really have to think outside the box right now. And if you're not, proactive, you're going to be reactive, and that may be too late. So, take parking, for example. There's major developments happening right now in the multifamily sector, and parking requirements versus where they were even 2-3 years ago are greatly reduced, not just in TOD areas either, transit-oriented districts, but across the board. Office complexes right now. Also very interesting that a lot of developers, well, some savvy ones that, one of the crazy statistics that this ties into is that they say if you are 6 years old or younger, you will never have a driver's license. With automated cars and Lyft, and that technology is 10 years away. So you're 6 now, 16, you will not have a driver's license. So it's stunning. Some people say that it's 10 to 15. So office developers and some people that we're consulting with, we're telling them when they're building their parking decks to bump those decks up, not to meet the minimum 7 feet, 8 inches, or 8 feet, 2 inches, but to bump them up so that in 5 years, 10 years, those could be converted to office space or other units or amenities for a building. So some of that, if it goes that way, you need to see those things. And that's just one example of how, communities or economic development directors need to start thinking, this is what the communities wanted for the past 20 years, and this is what we all vote for on the board, and so this is what we have to stick to. It's really part of that of looking, where are we going to be in 5 to 10 years, and how do we have to be converting our mindset outside the box?
So I'm actually, I'm back to my roots here in Chicago and working, I'm developing an e-commerce last mile, as we may call it, facility near in the old stockyards down here in Chicago. And our alderman down there, is learned that, is to say, this adaptation. I mean, don't get me wrong, from the planning people in the room, planning is absolute necessary. And PUDs and all those type of things are critical to controlling growth and development in general. But I think as both Trish and Steve were talking about and alluding to, is that even being more open-minded from a development perspective or planning perspective, of saying that what we historically saw in certain districts in certain areas, an evolution of that is coming, and that's once again, I think, driven really by the consumer and the experience that they're having, and the lifestyle that they're living, different than when even I was growing up, in kind of the view of that in general. Beyond the bricks and mortars of the physical, real estate, what other thoughts or concerns do we have by this change in this dynamic? And it's my question being broader based through Trish and Steve, is things probably more on the economic development side. Trish, is just tax incentives and tax restructuring incentives. We always talk about, Kelly, one of our major topics is job training and how is it affected, and from physically training someone who may not elect to go to a four-year school, or does and gets more consumer finance or consumer science type of degree, whether it's being in retail. I remember one of my aunts actually received a degree literally in retail years ago. So her schooling and education was taught to be more the management side of a retailer. What are these other topics that we're experiencing, beyond the brick and mortar that we're hearing with this change and shift in the real estate world?
So a couple of thoughts on that. I'm going to come back to the training piece at the end, but we were kind of just talking about the planning and the zoning aspects in Milwaukee, and this kind of brings in that talent and also kind of the future of transportation and connecting your employees or your workforce to your projects, is that we've seen a company, ET Reman, they're a manufacturer, a transmission remanufacturer, that have gone from a pick and save building to now 150,000 square foot Walmart building. And they have about 300 employees. And so that's a huge switch to put an traditional industrial user in a retail spot. So that really takes kind of matching what the community is looking for, what the community is. It's obviously still jobs, but that's just a different way of thinking about the reuse of a space. In terms of kind of what we're planning ahead, I think that the training conversation goes back to kind of what the previous presentation was, in working with the companies, those leaders, the Amazons, to decide what are we going to need, because I don't think we really know yet. And as Amazon's looking for this second HQ facility, I know economic developers around the country are thinking, okay, what can we do to help them provide the talent? How can we show that we're going to be there, ready to train, ready to partner with them to provide those 50,000 people that they plan to employ? I'm not sure anybody has a great idea yet that's come out of that, but I think it's going to have to be really like the same thing with the partnership with Rockwell and Foxconn, is building it from scratch almost.
Well, and Steve, here is that when we saw the redevelopment of the West Side here, the near West Side, and now we're kind of seeing it going out the River North corridor, and seeing what's happening there. It's not just to say that McDonald's and Google and Microsoft and others moved down here, or put a regional headquarters, or literally brought their entire corporate headquarters down here. But all of a sudden, that affects everything. It affects the whole area, the whole neighborhood, the whole dynamic, from the multifamily to the retail to the need for restaurants and all that. It's an evolution area in general, so I kind of see that we're all in agreement of even some of these types of physical bricks and mortars of real estate may be changing. It doesn't mean that readaptation or retrofit type mentality is something that can't be overcome or thought about or worked through. So
Yeah, one of the things, Jim, that I think is a buzz, or going to be a buzz, that we'll all hear a lot about is over the next 5 years in online sales, there'll be $211 billion of sales tax not paid in online sales. And so I think that as this evolves with the effect on bricks and mortar, one of the things that's going to have to follow suit is where does that additional income come from for areas that count on it for their economic growth? And so I look and think that there's going to be, we're in a transition right now. This is not totally moved that way, but it's happening. And in the meantime, everybody's trying to balance and react to it. And so, even retailers are trying to react to it. Where do they keep products? How many sizes do they keep? Their merchandise. Is it easy to just tell the customer, we don't have it here, but we're going to order it and it'll be at your house in 2 days? Is 2 days quick enough? It goes to fulfillment and the last mile. And that's a discussion point for us too. But I mean, that somewhere those dollars have to be back recaptured and brought to the communities. I think that's going to be a hot topic that we're all going to hear about in the next year or two.
So maybe throw, please, while we're there. Yeah, microphone, sorry. My bad.
In the beginning, to give the internet a start, they didn't tax the sales tax. I thought that was all gone now. Am I
So,
interpreting it wrong? Is it just the location where the tax goes to?
It's
Yes.
also unfortunately who's doing it and where the state it's going to.
Right.
So you may have larger national retailers that follow that to the letter of the law because they're publicly traded, and then you may have regionals or locals that ship to 20 states and 12 of them require it, but I don't know quite sure which ones require it, or so it's easier to not
Got it.
pay it.
We have a question over here also.
Sure.
Hi, I'd love to hear the panel comment on Amazon and what they're solving with Whole Foods in one part and what you see that impacting for the industry.
Well, my view, and it's maybe myopic, but they're also, I think Amazon, and I've been lucky to do business with Amazon from a real estate perspective, or Walmart now as a whole e-com division that very little people realize, but their whole supply chain and distribution changed just to focus on specific locations for e-commerce. One of the first was towards Indianapolis. They've done one down in Atlanta. So these massive facilities we see up in Kenosha, like Amazon's, or the one that's being completed down in Manteno. There's a couple others around Chicago here. That whole supply chain is evolving from a retailer perspective as well. The Whole Foods, the answer that I would have is Amazon's not naive to the fact that us as consumers and spenders still like an experience sometimes. And I don't believe that the whole bricks and mortar retail end of Whole Foods is going to disappear. But ultimately, I think we all are naive. That one of the main reasons why Amazon purchased Whole Foods was because now they want to jump deeper into the food and beverage business in general, in the grocery business as we call it. To jump deeper into that. I mean, I saw recently something about pharmaceuticals. You want to get in the pharma business, and them as is a company in general, and just watching that evolution of the complete supply chain is, to me, is you never know what the next step's going to be, and it's an amazing amazing process. So
Let me give you a correlation to your question that could fit, because we really don't know, right? But it's a great question. I've advised clients at different times that, and we'll take the grocery industry for example, that open up 30 to 60,000 square foot grocery stores. When I have seen a triple net retail mall that's grocery anchored on the market, advise them to purchase it. They're in the grocery business. Maybe it has 7 to 10 years left on a lease, maybe with a 5-year option. And it's a deal, right? You're going to get a 6% to 7% return on your investment. So it's a good, sound investment. You're not losing money annually. So the deal stands on its own. The background noise is that you're in the grocery business. So whatever the grocery anchored tenant is, when they come up for their lease expiration in 7 years, don't you love owning a mall that you can plug and play your own brand into and not renew their specific lease? Or that you could say, here's your leasing terms and take your 7% investment to a 14. So it's kind of a global approach. Back to Amazon now is we don't really know why, right? But they did buy a ton of opportunity and space and footprint to be able to do future distribution out of these locations. And if they have to convert 10,000 of a 60,000 square foot store or 30,000, or have a kiosk for direct pickup, or, getting trucks out to, last mile delivery and distribution. Those are things that I think, they really look at outside the box to say, these are the presence we want to be in. These are the markets, and this is the easiest way to be there. Let's stop trying to redefine and go, hey, how do we get this density surrounding a new building that we want to build? Let's just buy the income that's already in place from a successful business and control the future of what we can do out of the space.
Wouldn't you also say, Steve, that these locations just happen to be in the demographic areas that match the profiles of who their food
Clients
customers
are,
will be?
yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
Here I heard another one recently is that they're in major metroplexes, and that's across the country with the Whole Foods acquisition, is that now they're exploring that they'll be able to deliver things like wine to your house within 3 hours. So the only way you can do that is with a whole different network than they've had historically of people like that, I guess. Let's throw a party. Give me 3 hours to set it up. So is that people like that type of stuff, and in the perspective is that, you can make that decision last minute. I mean, you think about it as that even 3, 4, 5 years ago, anywhere you were in the country, is that, a UPS truck or your USPS truck would show up to your house, or a FedEx truck would show up to your house with your Amazon delivery. Now it's these white vans flying all over the major metroplexes. So we'll get to that in a second, because I know we're getting close on time. But one other curveball I want to throw at the two of you is that the medical world. In the medical world, once again, and my mom was probably my best preparer for these topics in general today, Kelly, was that she's a nurse, retired nurse, and we were talking about when I was a kid, if I got hurt, I went to the emergency room. And then eventually this evolution started occurring. There's a lot of consolidation in the medical industry from a provider perspective, less, the bio or device world, that kind of stuff, but really provider perspective. And then all of a sudden we started seeing these primary cares popping up and these, secondary cares, and what does all that mean? And then eventually is that, my doctor's office ended up right down the street from me in a retail, type setting in general. I mean, talking about this smaller scale or more regional, retail concern from a bricks and mortar perspective, is there going to be another level of this change in our medical world from a getting to physically going to visit your doctor, because
there will be.
It keeps coming closer and closer to us.
Whoever can get me the Z-Pack the fastest. So if that's log on and, show them symptoms, I'm in.
Yeah, no, and I think it's also looking at the range and the scale. You've got boutique, whether it's like dental or your braces. I'm losing the word for it. But
orthodontist.
But thank you, orthodontist. I had the podiatrist in my head.
Yeah,
That's the wrong.
perfect.
That's the other end. Or you see that. I know when I lived out in California, I think you went to one building for labs. You went to another one for like if you're pregnant, for your my goodness sakes, losing the scan.
Yeah.
Oh my Lord. But
I should know this. I did one last week.
And what is it called? Thank you.
Yeah,
Ultrasound. So I think you're already seeing a lot of it, but more and more as people's tastes get, they just want to be more specific.
Well, tell me here. I had an MRI recently for something, and I went to a specific location, which is more in a retail, what I would picture as a retail type physical location, and it was for my MRI and in more of a storefront, and got my MRI done. And
A lot of it is just cost-based, and a lot of everything that we're talking about today, it is a creative idea plus math equals a result, okay? And that math is such a key component of everything that we're talking about, because these are adaptive reuse places that you typically wouldn't see medical in, but you are now. And it's probably because, I bet the place you went to wasn't in Oak Brook Mall.
No.
It was probably in a Class D or C retail mall that's $12 a foot, because the retail industry evolved, and that's a low-cost alternative because the equipment's expensive. And if you want to put that into a medical district or area, you're paying $35 triple net. So some of that evolves in it. It's going on with office space right now.
Well, yeah, thank you. And we're getting, once again, I keep this thing unstructured and I run out of time, but we've got a couple more minutes
Go
for
ahead.
questions, so.
Yeah, thank you. So how do I represent 130 mayors from the Great Lakes region. How do the mayors deal with the situation that you're, in essence, presenting to them? Which is they had the industries, and I don't worry as much about the large cities simply because they have almost their own economy. But your smaller and medium-sized cities had their industries. The industries picked up, left. So then these small industrial towns suffered. So they tried to recreate themselves. So from the tax base perspective, you're taking away their tax base. Malls and retail are failing. And yet when you talk about growing, you're growing big boxes out by the highways, which now, number one, add to congestion. Number two, reduce the amount of tax revenue the cities have coming in. And how are they going to survive if they don't even have the tax revenue to build the quality of life that you want for the young kids that are going to be there? So what I worry about is our smaller and medium-sized cities going through another industrial revolution that's a reverse industrial revolution. You're just moving everything out, and then you're transporting it back and forth, which adds to our climate issues. It may be simple for people, but the cities lose the retail and tax perspective. How do they grow? How do we prevent that from happening?
So I think I'll start with that one just because we've seen it a number of times, and those communities that have done it well, and their mayors are engaged, not just with the community and their constituents, but their universities and talent that's coming out of them, or companies that are tapping into that talent and bringing them there. Jamf and Eau Claire is a great example, or working with the communities to build like incubation centers in the downtown. So you're kind of bringing business in, and you're developing talent, you're creating new ideas, you're creating new potential, but it's kind of like, you can't just expect some big company to come and land there. You really have to start thinking about how to grow it yourself, in all honesty. And one thing, speaking of that, is in some of these smaller communities, they had like a large not a big box retail in the downtown, but you have like a Steinmart or maybe a JCPenney's or something like that. And the universities, if you've got a local university or even a regional play, can be a big partner in that. Like things like art centers, or in Riverside, we had the Community College Culinary Arts located in the downtown. So now you've not only activated space, but you've brought people in there, intentionally brought people that will always be cycling through there. So that's just another tenet to be thinking about in the downtowns in those areas.
I'm not sure on the population and size of these mayors that you're talking about in some of the areas. I'm sure that it's diverse in different spots, but one of the things that I think is happening, or going to definitely happen, is that some of them, unfortunately, there may not be an answer for them. It may be dust in the wind, because there's larger areas that these younger generations are going to, and the smaller towns, it's hard for them to gain that impact of that lost revenue or business. And unless you are, kind of a sexy destination that people want to go to or drive through, that economic growth of that, when they're losing all of those factors, is very difficult to overcome. And the changing, evolving, workforce and structure in some of the smaller communities, does young talent want to go back to those areas? We've seen it in Chicago, that they all want to live in the West Loop and River North. And, the last thing they want to do is be back in those communities. So those mayors, to answer your question for me, is they really have to be in touch with all generations in their community. Because the people that are going to be coming and moving the needle on their elections are probably not the future, of their community. That's the people they need to touch and involve and activate and bring back.
That's a great point. I'm going to tap on that. So one of the things that Wisconsin has done, I think I see Ian over here who is involved in this, is they, Milwaukee, in the Milwaukee area, had a very strong kind of millennial kind of focus in terms of building millennials, creating a space, creating an environment where they felt that they could thrive. And so we tapped into that and leveraged what they've done and helped other communities throughout Wisconsin through their work build capacity in their young professional groups, getting them engaged. But the other piece of it is, as to Steve's point, is helping the existing leadership understand that they need to be talking to them. They need to be including them in like their planning commissions on even city councils or elected seats, because if they're wanting to nurture that sort of the population, they have to understand them.
If you don't give them a voice, they're gone.
Yep.
We'll see, John, we'll see if our president continues his earliest discussion about bringing manufacturing back to shore. And that is, to me, being an industrial person, one of the biggest things that should happen or could happen, needs to happen for a lot of those small towns that you're referring to in the manufacturing world, to get the people back to the location they need to be able to create those retail and other type of bases. So I know we're out of time. One more? Thanks, Kelly.